She's just a black waitress. Say it in Hungarian. Nathaniel Pierce smirked as the skyline of Manhattan glowed behind him like a kingdom built on money and ego. The men around the private table chuckled into crystal whiskey glasses worth more than most people's weekly paycheck. And somewhere beneath the soft jazz drifting through the sky lounge, dignity quietly tightened its grip. Rain crawled down the massive glass windows of the 52nd floor like silver veins under city light. Below them, yellow cabs moved through wet streets like tiny sparks. Above them, wealth floated effortlessly beneath chandeliers imported from Milan. The restaurant was called Arrogance, a place where billionaires came not just to eat, but to remind each other who mattered. And tonight, Nathaniel Pierce intended to own the room. At 41, Nathaniel had built Pierce Global into one of the most ruthless investment firms in America. Tech acquisitions, international mergers, silent takeovers worth billions. He wore confidence like a custom-tailored suit. Sharp jawline, steel gray eyes, the kind of smile that never reached his soul. Men feared him in boardrooms because he enjoyed making people uncomfortable, especially people beneath him, especially women, especially staff. Across the table sat Victor Ballo, a wealthy Hungarian investor with old European money and careful eyes. Nathaniel wanted Victor's signature on a multi-billion-dollar partnership before midnight. But Nathaniel didn't just enjoy winning deals. He enjoyed humiliating people while doing it. And standing only a few feet away, balancing a tray of wine glasses with steady hands, was the perfect target. Aaliyah Brooks moved quietly between the tables like she had mastered the art of invisibility. 26 years old, dark curls pulled neatly behind her shoulders. Black uniform pressed perfectly despite a double shift that had already stretched past 10 hours. Guests rarely looked directly at her. They looked through her. To most people inside Arrogance, she was just another waitress trying to survive New York rent. Another black woman carrying expensive wine for rich people who barely remembered her face 5 seconds later. But Aaliyah noticed everything. Every glance. Every whisper. Every fake smile polished by money. She noticed how Nathaniel snapped his fingers instead of saying "excuse me." She noticed how his friends laughed half a second too hard at his jokes. And she noticed the way Victor shifted uncomfortably every time Nathaniel switched into Hungarian. "Tell him the liabilities disappear after quarter 3, Nathaniel said casually in Hungarian while swirling bourbon in his glass. By the time his people realize it, we'll already control the patents. Victor's expression stiffened slightly. Nathaniel leaned back, amused by his own arrogance. "And don't worry," he added in the same language, glancing toward Aaliyah without lowering his voice. "The waitress doesn't understand a word. Americans barely speak English." Laughter rippled across the table. Soft at first, then louder. One man adjusted his Rolex and smirked. "Careful," he joked in Hungarian. "She might spill the wine once she realizes rich people are talking." Nathaniel laughed harder than anyone. Aaliyah kept pouring the Cabernet slowly into Victor's glass. Her face remained calm, professional, controlled, but something behind her eyes changed. Not anger, not embarrassment, recognition. The kind that arrives when someone underestimates you one time too many. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan like distant drums. Inside Arrogance, nobody noticed the silence growing around the waitress. Nobody noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the bottle. Nobody noticed that Aaliyah Brooks understood every single word. Aaliyah stepped away from the table before anyone could notice the shift in her breathing. The polished marble floor reflected the gold chandelier light beneath her shoes as she moved through the crowded lounge with controlled calm. But inside her chest, old memories had already begun to rise like ghosts refusing to stay buried. Hungarian. Of all the languages Nathaniel Pierce could have chosen, it had to be Hungarian. Her father used to call it the language of survival. Difficult, sharp, beautiful when spoken correctly. He used to sit beside her at the tiny kitchen table in their apartment in Queens with flashcards spread everywhere while snow tapped against the windows during New York winters. "Languages tell you who respects you," he would say softly while correcting her pronunciation. "People reveal themselves when they think you cannot understand." At the time, she was only 13 years old, laughing between spoonfuls of cereal while trying to imitate his accent. Back then, life still felt safe. Before the hospital bills, before the funeral, before she traded college textbooks for serving trays and double shifts. Aaliyah reached the service station near the back of the lounge and set down the wine bottle carefully. Her hands remained steady because years of working around wealthy strangers had taught her something important. Rich people watch for reactions, especially men like Nathaniel Pierce. Men who enjoyed turning discomfort into entertainment. Men who measured power by how small they could make someone else feel. Table 12 still needs sparkling water. Another server whispered while rushing past her with a tray of oysters. Aaliyah nodded automatically, but her attention stayed fixed on the private corner of Oraline, where Nathaniel's laughter still floated through the room like smoke. The entire restaurant carried the illusion of elegance. White marble walls, candlelight glowing beneath crystal fixtures imported from Italy. Soft piano replacing the jazz now. Every detail designed to whisper exclusivity. Yet beneath all that beauty lived the same ugly truth Aaliyah had seen 1,000 times before. Some people believed money gave them permission to humiliate others. Across the lounge, Nathaniel loosened the cuff of his charcoal suit, while Victor studied the contract sitting untouched beside his whiskey glass. The Hungarian investor no longer looked relaxed. Tiny cracks had started forming beneath the polished surface of the meeting. Nathaniel noticed it too, which only made him push harder. "Trust me," Nathaniel said again in Hungarian, lowering his voice slightly. "Once the acquisition closes, your people will depend entirely on our infrastructure. By then, there is nothing they can do." Victor glanced toward the windows. Rain streaked across the glass behind him in crooked silver lines. "That was not our original agreement," he answered carefully. Nathaniel smiled without warmth. "Agreements change. That is business." Then his eyes drifted back toward Aaliyah as she approached with fresh water glasses. "Besides," Nathaniel added in Hungarian, loud enough for the table to hear, "nobody here understands enough to care." Another round of quiet laughter followed. But Victor did not laugh this time. He watched Aaliyah instead. Really watched her. The calm expression. The silence. The way her eyes never dropped to the floor the way intimidated people usually did around powerful men. Something about her composure unsettled him. Aaliyah placed the water glass beside Nathaniel smoothly. He barely acknowledged her existence. "Careful with the contract," one executive joked in Hungarian. "We would not want the waitress reading confidential information." Nathaniel smirked into his bourbon. "She probably thinks Budapest is a type of dessert." This time, nobody laughed immediately, because Aaliyah finally looked directly at him, just for 1 second. And in that second, Nathaniel Pierce felt something unfamiliar crawl quietly beneath his confidence. Not fear, not yet, but the uncomfortable feeling that perhaps the room was no longer moving according to his rules. The storm outside grew heavier, wrapping Manhattan in sheets of rain that blurred the city into streaks of white and gold. Inside Oraline, the temperature stayed perfectly controlled, the music soft, the silverware polished enough to reflect candlelight like tiny mirrors. Wealth always tried to look calm, even when tension was sitting directly at the table. Nathaniel Pierce leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed every room belonged to him eventually. He adjusted the expensive watch beneath his sleeve and glanced at the contract again before sliding another page toward Victor Ballo. "You are overthinking this," he said in English now, his tone smooth enough for nearby guests to hear only professionalism. "Pierce Global does not lose partnerships." Victor gave a polite nod, but his eyes drifted toward the untouched document. Something in his expression had changed over the last 10 minutes. Caution had quietly replaced excitement. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Men like him always noticed weakness, hesitation, uncertainty. He built entire billion-dollar negotiations around those moments. So he smiled wider. "Another bourbon," he said casually while tapping 2 fingers against the table without looking toward Aaliyah. Not a request, an expectation. Aaliyah returned moments later carrying a fresh crystal glass on a black serving tray balanced effortlessly against one hand. The amber liquid caught the warm overhead lighting as she approached the table again. Calm, silent, controlled. Nathaniel watched her carefully this time. He could not explain why. There was simply something unsettling about the way she carried herself now. Most employees shrank after embarrassment. Most people avoided eye contact after becoming the center of a joke. But Aaliyah moved like someone carrying a private truth nobody else in the room understood yet. "Tell me something," Nathaniel said suddenly in Hungarian while she poured the bourbon beside him. Do all American service workers train to look miserable, or is that natural talent? One executive snorted into his drink. Another shook his head, amused. Victor remained silent. Aaliyah finished pouring without spilling a single drop. Nathaniel continued speaking in Hungarian, enjoying himself more with every sentence. I almost admire it, he said. Imagine spending your entire life carrying trays while people like us decide the future of industries. He raised his glass slightly toward Victor. That is the difference between ambition and background noise. This time the laughter sounded thinner, less comfortable, because something strange was happening at the table. Victor was no longer watching Nathaniel. He was watching Aaliyah, specifically her face, her eyes, the tiny flicker of understanding she could no longer fully hide. And then Nathaniel made the mistake powerful men often make when they mistake silence for weakness. He underestimated how much people reveal when they believe nobody can challenge them. After the acquisition, Nathaniel said in Hungarian again, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, we shift the debt exposure onto Ballo Holdings. 6 months later, we liquidate the secondary assets and leave his board scrambling. One of the executives gave an uneasy laugh. You make it sound ruthless. Nathaniel smirked. Business is ruthless. Victor slowly placed his whiskey glass onto the table. The sound landed softly against the marble surface, but somehow it cut through the entire room louder than thunder. That was not our understanding, Victor replied carefully in Hungarian. Nathaniel waved dismissively. By the time your attorneys catch it, the market will already move. Trust me. Aaliyah stood perfectly still beside the table. The city lights reflected faintly in her dark eyes while memories of her father's voice echoed somewhere deep inside her mind. People reveal themselves when they think you cannot understand. Nathaniel finally glanced up toward her again, amused by his own arrogance. Relax, he joked in Hungarian to the others. She is just here to refill glasses. And for the first time all night, Aaliyah Brooks spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly enough to stop the entire table cold. Actually, sir, she said in flawless Hungarian, I believe Mr. Ballo deserves to know exactly what is hidden in Section 14 before he signs anything tonight. Silence spread across the table so fast, it almost felt physical. Even the piano near the lounge entrance seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those few calm words. Nathaniel Pierce did not blink at first. He simply stared at Aaliyah as though his brain needed an extra second to process what had just happened. Her Hungarian was flawless. Not hesitant. Not rehearsed. Fluent in the effortless way only years of study could create. Victor Ballo slowly turned in his chair toward her, disbelief flickering across his face. One of the executives nearly dropped his drink. Another looked down at the contract immediately, suddenly very interested in the paperwork he had ignored all evening. Aaliyah remained standing beside the table with one hand lightly resting against the serving tray. Calm. Posture. Steady breathing. The same waitress uniform. The same polished black shoes. Yet somehow the entire room looked at her differently now. Nathaniel finally leaned forward, forcing a thin smile back onto his face. Excuse me, he asked in English, each word clipped carefully. Aaliyah met his eyes without hesitation. Section 14, she repeated softly. The liability transfer clause attached to the infrastructure integration timeline. Victor's expression darkened instantly. He grabbed the contract and flipped pages faster now, his fingers suddenly tense against the paper. Rain hammered harder against the windows behind him, while the city glowed in blurred gold beneath the storm clouds. Nathaniel let out a quiet laugh, but it sounded strained this time. That is enough, he said coldly. You are a waitress, not legal counsel. Aaliyah nodded once. That is true. Her voice stayed respectful. Professional. Controlled. But language does not stop existing just because you think the wrong person hears it. One executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another reached for his phone before thinking better of it. Because the atmosphere around the table had changed completely now. Just minutes earlier, Nathaniel controlled every conversation in the room. Every laugh. Every glance. But power is fragile when humiliation suddenly changes direction. Victor stopped turning pages. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he looked back up at Nathaniel. You plan to bury the debt exposure under secondary asset restructuring, he said quietly in Hungarian. Nathaniel's confidence cracked for the first time all night. Just slightly. Barely visible. But visible enough. That is standard negotiation structure, he replied quickly. Victor's eyes narrowed. No, that is deception. The word landed harder than anyone expected. Nearby guests had started noticing the tension now. Conversations softened around the lounge. A couple seated near the bar glanced toward the private table while pretending not to stare. Wealthy people love drama, as long as it happened to someone else. Nathaniel straightened his posture immediately, trying to regain control of the room through force of personality alone. This misunderstanding is exactly why staff should not interfere in executive discussions, he said sharply while looking directly at Aaliyah. But she did not shrink beneath his tone. She simply stood there, composed in a way that unsettled him even more. You mocked my intelligence for the last 30 minutes, she said quietly. Now suddenly my understanding matters too much? Nobody laughed this time. Not one person. Victor slowly closed the contract and placed both hands on top of it. Where did you learn Hungarian? He asked softly. The question carried none of the arrogance Nathaniel used earlier. Only genuine curiosity. For the first time that evening, someone at the table spoke to Aaliyah like she belonged in the conversation. Her expression softened just slightly. My father immigrated from Budapest when he was 19, she answered. He taught comparative linguistics at Queen's College before he passed away. Victor stared at her for a moment longer, visibly stunned. Then he switched fully into Hungarian again. Faster now. More natural. Testing her. Aaliyah answered every sentence without hesitation. Perfect grammar. Perfect pronunciation. The executives looked between them in complete disbelief while Nathaniel sat frozen beside his untouched bourbon, watching the woman he dismissed as background noise become the most respected voice at the table. The storm outside Oraline had turned the Manhattan skyline into a blur of silver rain and fractured light. But inside the private lounge, nobody seemed to notice the city anymore. Every eye at the table stayed fixed on Aaliyah Brooks. The waitress Nathaniel Pierce had reduced to a joke only minutes earlier was now calmly discussing complex contract terminology in flawless Hungarian with one of the most powerful investors in Eastern Europe. The shift in power felt almost unreal. Nathaniel could feel it happening in real time, slipping through his fingers like water. Men like him spent their entire lives controlling perception, reputation, atmosphere. That was the true currency of wealth. And tonight, for the first time in years, Nathaniel no longer controlled the room. Victor Ballo leaned back slowly in his chair while studying Aaliyah with open fascination now. Your accent, he said carefully in Hungarian. It sounds almost native. Your father must have been very proud. A flicker of emotion crossed her face before disappearing behind professionalism again. He believed language was about respect, she answered softly. He used to say people become honest when they think nobody understands them. The sentence landed like a blade wrapped in silk. Nathaniel grabbed his bourbon glass immediately, masking irritation behind another forced smile. This has become unnecessarily dramatic, he interrupted in English. A misunderstanding over translation does not change the value of the partnership. But nobody responded right away. That silence bothered him more than open disagreement would have. One executive avoided eye contact entirely. Another adjusted his tie while pretending to reread financial projections on the table. Because deep down, everyone understood the real problem was no longer the contract. It was character. Wealthy rooms survive on image. The illusion that powerful people deserve their power. And once that illusion cracks, even slightly, people begin re-evaluating everything. Victor closed the contract folder completely now. You intentionally concealed financial exposure, he said to Nathaniel in English this time. Calm, controlled, public. Nathaniel exhaled sharply through his nose. Every merger has strategic leverage points. Not hidden ones, Victor replied. Not while mocking the intelligence of the people serving your table. The words hit harder because they came without anger. Just disappointment. Across the lounge, a few nearby guests had started quietly recording on their phones beneath the table line. Tiny glowing screens reflected against crystal glasses. In New York, scandals traveled faster than subway trains. Nathaniel noticed immediately. His jaw tightened. No confidential discussions should involve restaurant staff, he snapped while turning toward Aaliyah again. You crossed a professional boundary. But Aaliyah did not flinch beneath his tone. No, sir, she answered calmly. You crossed one first. Another. Silence. Heavy this time. the kind that exposes truths nobody can comfortably ignore anymore. Rain pounded harder against the giant windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, while thunder rolled low across the skyline. Somewhere near the piano bar, a glass shattered accidentally and made several people jump. Nathaniel stared at Aaliyah as though trying to force the universe back into its original shape through sheer willpower alone. But the damage was already done. The illusion had cracked, and everyone saw it now. Victor slowly stood from the table and buttoned his dark navy suit jacket. In Budapest, he said quietly while looking at Nathaniel, "My grandfather used to own a small restaurant after the war. He taught me something important." He glanced toward Aaliyah briefly before continuing. "The way a person treats workers tells you who they really are when power is not being observed." Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, but Victor raised one hand slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to stop him. "Tonight," Victor continued, "I learned more about your character from your jokes than from your presentation." Nathaniel's face hardened instantly, because beneath all his money, all his influence, all his expensive confidence, he recognized the one thing billionaires fear most: public humiliation from someone they considered powerless. Nathaniel Pierce had spent most of his adult life believing respect could be purchased the same way people bought penthouses, political influence, or private jets. Throw enough money at the world, and eventually everyone smiled, nodded, and stayed quiet. That formula had worked for him in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to London. It had worked on journalists, investors, politicians, even competitors twice his age. But standing inside or aligned beneath the gold chandelier light, watching Victor Ballo slowly push away a multi-billion-dollar contract while a black waitress remained the calmest person in the room, Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Exposure. The kind no wealth can fully shield. "You are overreacting," Nathaniel said finally, forcing composure back into his voice. "One overheard conversation does not erase years of business success." Victor adjusted the cuff of his dark suit carefully before answering. "No," he replied quietly. "But arrogance reveals what success tries to hide." Around them, the lounge had become strangely still. Even nearby waitstaff sensed the tension now. A server carrying champagne slowed slightly while passing the private section. Two women near the piano stopped pretending not to stare. Somewhere behind the bar, somebody whispered Nathaniel's name under their breath. The atmosphere no longer belonged to him. Aaliyah remained beside the table with quiet dignity, but inside her mind memories continued surfacing faster now. Her father sitting in his worn brown sweater beside stacks of translated novels. The tiny apartment kitchen smelling like coffee at midnight while he taught her Hungarian grammar instead of sleeping after long university shifts. "Language is never just words," he used to tell her. "It is power. It reveals who believes they are above consequence." Back then, she never fully understood him. She did now. Nathaniel turned toward her sharply. "Tell me something," he said, trying to regain control through intimidation. "Was humiliating me your goal from the beginning?" The question hung heavily in the air, but Aaliyah did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him with the same steady eyes that had unsettled him all night. "No, sir," she said softly. "You humiliated yourself. I only understood the language." The silence afterward felt endless. One executive coughed awkwardly into his napkin. Another finally stood from the table and muttered something about needing to take a call. Wealthy people always sensed when a powerful man was beginning to fall, and they rarely stayed loyal longer than necessary. Nathaniel noticed that too. His expression darkened. "This conversation is finished," he said coldly while reaching for the contract folder again. But Victor placed one hand firmly over the papers before Nathaniel could pull them away. Not aggressive, just final. "No," Victor replied. "This partnership is finished." The words landed softly, yet somehow louder than thunder outside the windows. Nathaniel stared at him in disbelief. "You are walking away from a $10 billion expansion because of a waitress?" Victor shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "I am walking away because of the kind of man who thought a waitress was beneath respect." Aaliyah lowered her eyes briefly, not out of submission but restraint. Because moments like this were dangerous. Pride can tempt people into cruelty once power begins slipping away. But Nathaniel surprised her. He did not explode. He did not shout. Men like him understood public image too well for that. Instead, he smiled again. Thin, tight, artificial. You think this story ends well for her? He asked quietly while looking directly at Victor. The internet enjoys moments. Business survives power. Victor studied him for a long moment before answering. Perhaps, he said calmly. But tonight, the only person in this room who acted powerful was the woman carrying the tray. Across the lounge, a phone camera quietly captured Nathaniel's face at the exact moment those words landed. And somewhere deep beneath the polished surface of New York luxury, the beginning of a public reckoning had already started. By the time Victor Ballo walked away from the private table, the energy inside Oraline had changed completely. Conversations no longer flowed naturally through the rooftop lounge. They drifted in fragments now, whispered sentences behind raised hands, curious glances sliding toward Nathaniel Pierce before quickly looking away again. Wealthy people could smell vulnerability the way sharks smell blood in dark water. And tonight, one of Manhattan's untouchable billionaires suddenly looked human. Nathaniel remained seated for several long seconds after Victor disappeared toward the elevators with his legal advisor beside him. The untouched contract still rested on the marble table between half-finished drinks and expensive silverware. $10 billion. Gone in less than 15 minutes. Not because of market conditions. Not because of competition. Because Arrogance finally collided with someone who refused to stay invisible. Rain streaked down the towering windows behind the lounge, while flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the skyline beyond Central Park. The storm outside felt strangely fitting now. Controlled things were beginning to unravel. Nathaniel slowly loosened his tie and reached for his phone beneath the table. 3 missed calls already. 2 messages from Pierce Global executives asking if the deal had closed. Another from financial media requesting comment on rumors regarding Ballo Holdings. Rumors. The word tightened something in his chest immediately. He looked up sharply across the lounge. Near the piano bar, 2 younger investors were staring down at a phone screen together. One of them glanced toward Nathaniel, then quickly looked away. Another guest near the entrance whispered into her friend's ear while holding her own phone low against her purse. The realization hit him hard and fast. Somebody recorded it. Of course they did. New York did not miss opportunities like this. A powerful man embarrassing himself in public was worth more online than stock tips or celebrity gossip. Nathaniel stood abruptly from the table, forcing calm back into his expression even while frustration pulsed beneath the surface. "Where is she?" he asked one of the managers sharply. The manager blinked nervously. "Sir." "The waitress," Nathaniel said. "Aaliyah Brooks." The manager hesitated only briefly before pointing toward the service hallway near the kitchen entrance. Nathaniel walked across the lounge quickly, expensive dress shoes striking softly against polished marble while heads subtly turned behind him. Nobody stopped him. Nobody smiled at him either. Respect disappears quietly before people fully notice it is gone. Inside the service corridor, the atmosphere changed instantly. No chandeliers. No jazz. Just stainless steel counters, low fluorescent lighting, and the distant sound of dishes being cleaned behind swinging kitchen doors. Aaliyah stood alone near the employee lockers adjusting the sleeve of her black uniform calmly, as though the entire night had not just detonated across one of Manhattan's most elite restaurants. Nathaniel stopped several feet away from her. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain about what to say. Aaliyah noticed immediately. Powerful. Men rarely practiced humility enough to wear it naturally. "You cost me $10 billion tonight," he said finally, his voice lower now. Tired. Controlled. She looked at him quietly before answering. "No," she said. "Your choices did that." Nathaniel let out a humorless laugh. "You think this becomes some inspiring story?" he asked. "The waitress humiliates the billionaire. Everyone claps." End scene. But Aaliyah did not react to the sarcasm. She simply folded her apron carefully against her arm. "I was never trying to humiliate you," she answered softly. "I was trying to stop someone from being deceived." Nathaniel studied her face in silence. No arrogance. No triumph. No smug satisfaction. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Because deep down, he realized something uncomfortable. She had protected a stranger more honorably than he protected his own business partner. Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a younger server quietly glanced down at her phone before gasping softly. Another employee rushed beside her. Then another. Screens glowed beneath fluorescent lights while whispers spread rapidly through the hallway. Nathaniel felt his stomach sink before anyone even turned the phone toward him. The video had already gone online, and millions of people were beginning to watch the exact moment a black waitress shattered the illusion of a billionaire who thought nobody around him was listening. By midnight, the video had already escaped the walls of Arrogance and entered the one place even billionaires could not fully control: the internet. Tiny glowing screens lit up across Manhattan apartments, airport lounges, college dorm rooms, late-night diners, and subway platforms, while millions of strangers watched the same 47-second clip on repeat. Nathaniel Pierce smirking confidently in Hungarian. The laughter around the table. The mocking tone. Then Aaliyah Brooks answering back with calm, flawless precision while the entire room fell silent around her. The captions spread even faster than the video itself. Billionaire exposed by black waitress he tried to humiliate. She understood everything. This is what arrogance looks like. By 1 in the morning, major financial blogs were reposting the footage beside headlines questioning Pierce Global's ethics. Comment sections exploded with outrage. Some focused on Nathaniel's treatment of Aaliyah. Others focused on the hidden liability clause she exposed. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The woman carrying the tray showed more integrity than the man holding the contract. Inside his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, Nathaniel stood alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows while city lights flickered below him like scattered fire. His television played muted financial coverage in the background. Pierce Global stock had already dipped 3% in after-hours trading. 3 board members had requested an emergency meeting by morning. His public relations team kept calling. He ignored every call. Because for the first time in years, Nathaniel could not outmaneuver the narrative. The footage was too clean, too human, too real. He poured himself another bourbon and stared at the frozen image paused across social media feeds everywhere. Aaliyah standing perfectly still beside the marble table while powerful men looked suddenly small around her. Nathaniel hated how composed she looked. Not triumphant, not angry, just dignified. It made him appear even worse. Across Queens, inside a small apartment above a laundromat, Aaliyah sat quietly at her kitchen table with her shoes finally off and a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her hands. Rain still tapped softly against the windows while her old laptop screen filled with notifications faster than she could process them. Thousands of messages, interviews requests, news stations, podcasts, even language professors praising her fluency online. One message simply read, "Your father would be proud of you." That one nearly broke her composure more than everything else combined. On the wall beside the kitchen doorway hung a faded photograph of her father holding a much younger Aaliyah on his shoulders during a street fair in Queens. He looked exhausted in the picture. Thin, overworked, but smiling. He spent his life teaching students who often ignored him because of his accent. Yet every night he still came home believing language could build bridges between people instead of walls. Aaliyah looked at the photo for a long moment while the internet turned her into a symbol she never asked to become. Somewhere beneath all the headlines and hashtags, she still felt like the same woman who spent her evenings carrying trays through crowded restaurants to help cover rent and medical bills. Her phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering softly. "Hello." A deep, familiar voice responded almost immediately. "Victor Ballo. I hope I am not disturbing you," he said warmly. "Not at all," Aaliyah answered. Victor paused briefly before continuing. "I wanted you to know something. Tonight, you did more than protect me from a dishonest contract." His voice lowered slightly. "You reminded an entire room that intelligence does not always wear expensive suits." Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the weight of the night finally settling into her chest. Outside her apartment window, a subway train rattled through Queens while somewhere across Manhattan, Nathaniel Pierce sat alone in a glass tower realizing something painful. Money could buy influence, luxury, silence, but it could not buy back dignity once the world watched you lose it. Morning arrived over Manhattan wrapped in cold gray clouds and headlines that refused to disappear. Financial news anchors spoke carefully about ethical concerns surrounding Pierce Global, while social media moved much less cautiously. The clip from Arrogance had crossed 20 million views before sunrise. Every major platform carried a different version of the same moment. Nathaniel Pierce laughing in a language he assumed made him untouchable. Aaliyah Brooks answering with intelligence sharp enough to cut through wealth, status, and ego in a single sentence. Inside Pierce Global Headquarters, executives filled the glass conference room with nervous energy and untouched coffee cups. Nobody smiled. Nobody joked. Screens displayed falling stock numbers beside breaking news alerts while legal advisors whispered urgently near the back wall. Nathaniel stood at the far end of the room, staring down at the city below without speaking. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt powerful around him. It felt heavy. One board member finally cleared his throat carefully. "We need to discuss public response strategy," he said. Another interrupted immediately. "Public response is not the issue anymore. Investors are questioning judgment." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. Judgment. Strange how one word could suddenly summarize an entire career. Less than 24 hours earlier, people in rooms like this treated him like a visionary. Now they studied him like a liability. Wealth can disappear slowly. Respect disappears all at once. Across Queens, Aaliyah tied the apron around her waist again beneath the warm yellow lights of Oraline's employee locker room. The internet might have transformed her into a viral headline overnight, but rent still existed. Bills still existed. Real life rarely pauses for public attention. Several coworkers stared when she walked through the hallway that morning. One server grinned proudly while another quietly squeezed her hand. Even the restaurant manager suddenly spoke to her with a softness she had never heard before. Funny how quickly dignity becomes visible once the world approves of it. Aaliyah noticed that too, but she did not let bitterness settle inside her. Her father taught her something more valuable than languages: grace. The lunch rush had barely started when the front entrance of Oraline opened, and every conversation near the hostess stand slowed instantly. Nathaniel Pierce stepped inside alone wearing a dark overcoat and none of the confidence he carried the night before. No assistants. No executives. No security. Just a man walking into a room that no longer feared him. Aaliyah saw him immediately from across the dining floor. For one long second, neither of them moved. Rain tapped softly against the windows while silverware clinked quietly around the restaurant. Nathaniel approached slowly until he stopped beside her station. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Heavy. Earned. Aaliyah looked at him calmly. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because the internet turned against you?" Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly. Another thing he was clearly unpracticed at. Honesty. "No," he answered quietly. "Because somewhere along the way, I started believing people only mattered if they could benefit me." Aaliyah studied him carefully. The expensive suit remained. The polished appearance remained. But the arrogance had cracks in it now. Real ones. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed a business card on the counter between them. "Victor offered you a position with his international division this morning," he said. "You should take it." Aaliyah glanced at the card but did not pick it up immediately. "And what do you think I should do?" she asked. Nathaniel let out the smallest breath of self-awareness. "Honestly," he said quietly, "I think you already became more successful than me the moment you chose dignity over humiliation." For the first time since this story began, Aaliyah smiled. Not because she defeated a billionaire. Not because the internet made her famous. But because somewhere in the middle of all the arrogance, noise, and money, one simple truth finally became impossible to ignore. Power sounds impressive in expensive rooms. But character echoes much longer after the room goes quiet.